Gracias. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Julieta Brambilla. I'm General Director of Communication, Public Service Information, and Institutional Relations at INEGI. Thank you to the Center for Mexico-U.S. Studies here to hosting this event. You are very our institutional allies, so we are very happy to be here. And thank you also to be here in this last seminar, this session, in which I will talk about our national survey on sexual and gender diversity 2021. This is our first edition on this survey. So in what follows, I will refer to different strands, different topics about this survey. We will start with some background, some context about these instruments. Then I will explain a little bit a couple of key concepts and methods on this matter. Later, I will focus in some key findings. This is the core of our presentation. And at the end, I will refer to some social impact that this survey has been having in Mexico and some final considerations just at the very end. So let's start with the beginning. Why is it relevant to collect data from LGBT plus population? For this question, there could be several answers. Here I just list 3 of them that we believe are relevant. One of them is to understand and address challenges facing our community, this LGBT plus community. Secondly, to identify community-based needs. And thirdly, to address a growing social demands to produce official information about this community. Let me show you something about this latest, the thirdly list. In the following slide, you can see some data about how in the US the relevance and visibility and also the demand of information about this type of community has been growing in the last years. Here in the graph, you can see some search from Google Analytics about the following concepts of words. Am I gay? Am I a lesbian? Non-binary? Am I trans? And how to come out. And when we sum up all of them, we can see how in the last 19 years, all these words in the search has been growing exponentially, I would say. So this is only to illustrate something that is happening out there in our society and in somehow also inside other places, other spaces, like here probably in the very same university. Let me show you another graph. Support for same-sex relations, for instance, also has been growing in the US in the last 40 years. This figure from Gallup Pulse show us that from 1977 until 2021, the support for same-sex relations, that is to say, gay or lesbian relations between consenting adults, has been increasing from 43% to 79% in all these years. So it's something happening in society, and it's something happening that also allows to say and to recognize that has become very important as well to have some statistical visibility about these communities. And what is happening in Mexico? Let me show you one slide about this. The same-sex legal marriage in our country has been approved practically in all states, in all our 32 states up to date. That is to say that in the last 12 or 13 years, for different reasons, in each of the 32 states, there has been in place some kind of state legislation about this matter. So that is one of the aspects that we need to consider in order also to understand the relevance of this kind of surveys. So let's talk about our survey, the ENDISEG. Why ENDISEG is, for us, a cutting-edge survey? The survey, in a way, ends the statistical silence about demographic information of LGBT plus population in Mexico. This is so relevant, but we speak little about this. For the past decades, there was a vacuum about information on these matters. And this is why it's so relevant that we, for today, know more about the demographics about this population. The survey allows a national and subnational representativeness. And that is relevant in terms, for example, for policymakers and for policy analysis, and also to identify some needs of this community. And as well, the survey allows to make some comparisons between different groups, for instance, LGBT plus versus non-LGBT plus people, but also some comparisons inside the LGBT plus community, for instance, between transgender women and transgender men, and so. This is also a key part of these instruments. And the survey provides key information for LGBT plus community, for policymakers, for social actors, for instance, at the Congress, at the federal or subnational levels, and for society at large. Let me share with you a little bit of background about this survey. In the Institute, there have been different attempts to gauge different information about this community. Back in 2010, in our national census, we identified same-sex couple registrations. This was a work actually carried out by part of the staff that is here today with Octavio and the General Director, Mauricio, so it's part of our demographic surveys. Later on, in 2017, our national survey on discrimination estimate the discrimination against LGBT population, specifically in sexual orientation. Later on, in our census, in the national census 2020, we identify households where lived same-sex couples. So as you can see, there have been different attempts, but it was until 2018 and 2019 in which we developed a pilot study before we conduct actually our ENDISEG 2021. It's important to mention here as well that the development of this instrument was made in close relationship with other state agencies. For instance, our National Commission for Human Rights and the State Agency Against Discrimination that is called CONAPRED. And one important element here, and I think and I believe is also relevant in other kinds of similar instruments, is that the development of the questionnaire was developed in close relationship as well with some civil society organizations that are advocating for human rights of this community. And this is a key part also to understand the relevance of this instrument. The National Survey on Sexual and Gender Diversity 21 aims to estimate the total number of people over 15 years old that identify as part of the LGBT plus community in our country. But actually, the survey offers much more. The survey also collects information, for example, on sexuality, education, employment, health services, mental health, personal satisfaction with life, and other kind of topics. So as you can see, it's a very rich and a vast kind of information that the survey provides. and that is why also we believe is relevant. But before we go to the key findings, let's speak a little bit about key concepts and then about methods. There are some concepts that we believe is important to you to know, not only for this presentation, but also in order to understand, to better understand the survey. When we see this slide that was part of the communication strategy of this survey in social media in Mexico, we can start from the bottom with sex. That is, I think, a common concept within all. And sex here is the sex declared at birth. Could be male, could be female. And it's based, this declaration, exclusively on the person's external genitalia. That is one important aspect here. Then let's move to another concept that is a little bit more complicated, that is that of sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is the ability for each person to be sexually and emotionally attracted to another person of any kind of gender. That is to say, majority of population here and in Mexico is heterosexual. But when we move to the sexual orientation spectrum of diversity, we can find, for example, people who is bisexual, who is people which attract to other person from, for example, the two genders, or people who could be homosexual, who is people who can be gay or who can be lesbian. And there are, of course, other kind of sexual orientations in this diversity. And then let's move to the last one, that is gender identity. Gender identity is the self-identification of gender as each person perceives. And this one may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth. Cisgender, for example, is a person who their own gender identity corresponds with the sex assigned at birth. Most probably, majority of people in this room is cisgender. But when we speak about trans people, it's the people who change or do a transgressive move in their own lives to go beyond the sex assigned at birth, and could be people that is transgender as a transgender woman or transgender man, but also there are a big spectrum in trans people. So here we can also find people who is non-binary, for instance, or with a gender fluid. So all these concepts are relevant to understand what follows, that is some explanation about the findings. Just a little bit about this acronym, that is LGBT+, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and the plus that is all other non-cisgender and non-straight identities. Let's speak about methods on this survey. Our data collection period was from August 2021 to January 2022. The observation units are households and people aged 15 years and over. The collection method was electronic survey, face-to-face interview, and one important element here is self-reported audio interviews on sensitive issues during the questionnaire. This is relevant because in some questions, specifically those related to gender identity, to sexuality, and so, we use tablets and earphones in order to ensure not only privacy and confidentiality, but also to create an atmosphere of trust that is very relevant in order to conduct this kind of research. The national sample size was more than 4,000 housing units, more than 44,000 people aged over 15 years, and the interviewers were women, 160. Now let's move to some findings about this survey. And probably the most stunning and most important finding is actually this one, that in Mexico, when we look at people which is 15 years and over, 5 million people in Mexico are self-considered as part of the LGBT plus community. That is the same to say that is 5.1% of the population, or 1 in every 20 Mexicans. This is something similar to the population of a state like Chiapas or a country like Norway. So it's an important population just in terms of numbers, if we refer to that. But what happened when we break down this figure? We can see that there is a territorial distribution of the LGBT plus population in the country. This is somehow like a very intuitive graph. As you can see, some of the states with the highest number of population, total population beyond LGBT plus in the country also has the highest numbers of LGBT plus population. That is the case, for instance, of State of Mexico, Mexico City, Veracruz, Jalisco, or Nuevo León. But there is other way to look at these numbers. Let's see the next map. In this one, we can see LGBT plus population per state, but in terms of percentage of total population in that state. And in this one, we have a completely different picture. In this one, we can see how places like Colima or Yucatan or Querétaro have actually highest rates than the average national rates of prevalence of LGBT plus population. And that's a counterintuitive, probably fact or estimation, but it's something that this survey shows us. Let's look closely to sexual orientation and then to gender identity. When we look at sexual orientation, we can see how, for instance, 4.8% of the population, that is similar to say 4,006,100 people, self-identify as part of this diverse sexual orientation. And when we break down this figure, we can see how majority of them actually consider themselves bisexuals. That is 51% of this total. This is not an exception. Actually, in the US, in a similar exercise conducted by Gallup 2 years ago, they found something very similar to this. Let's move to gender identity. In this one, we can see how 0.9% of total population is self-considered as part of this transgender community. That is almost 1 million people. And again, it's not an exception. Here in the US, the Williams Institute, that actually is based in California, also found a similar figure some years ago. What is important here also to mention is that when we break down this almost 1% of the population, we can see how only 34% is self-considered as transgender or transsexual, whereas 65%, the majority of them, are part of other kinds of people of the trans spectrum. That is to say, non-binary, of gender fluid, or something similar. That is key part because in the media, but also in the public discourse, we tend to focus mainly on trans people, like transgender women, for example. But there is, as we see in these numbers, a highest number of people who belongs to other type of identity of this trans spectrum. One of the key parts in the survey is actually that one related to identification age. That is to say, at what moment in the life trajectory of the people they realize that they are part of the sexual orientation diversity with a gender identity which also is diverse. In this one, we can see in this graph how this could happen along all the way during the life trajectory, even in early childhood, or when people is during their teens or their youth, or during the adulthood. However, something that is important to mention is that early childhood seems to play an important role in this matter. For instance, for sexual orientation, 43.4% of the people realized that they were part of the diverse sexual orientation before 7 years old. And something similar happens also with the trans population, but in this case, the number is even higher, to 62.4%. That speaks also about the relevance to recognize trans childhood or trans kids, and there are legislations about that currently here in the US and also in Mexico. Other important aspect of this survey is about who knows about your sexual orientation or your gender identity. And in this one, we can see how the inner circle plays a key role in this aspect. There are important actors like mother, friends, siblings, couples, or another kind of relatives who are part of this supportive network and are key players enabling the development of the person. But one element that is actually very important and that we know because the method we use in the survey is that there is some amount of people, and in the case of trans people is 1 in 4, that have tell anybody, that is to say, nobody knows about their own gender identity in 25% of the cases. We know in the Institute that because of the methods that we use to do this survey. But this also speaks about the amount of the silence that still prevails on this matter. Another important figure is this one that is related to ages. So LGBT plus population tends to be younger. If we sum up, for example, all people between 15 and 24 years old, we can see that they count as for 50% of all LGBT plus population. And this change as we move up in the pyramid. There is some hypothesis behind this, but in the Institute we collect and disseminate the information, so there could be several interpretations about this figure. But let me show you something. In the US, in a similar poll conducted by Gallup, we can see how in the last years, in the last 10 years, there have been a move in social America in which the number of people self-identify as lesbian, gays, bisexual, transgender, or something other type of gender different to heterosexual or cisgender have increased. So probably we are here in front of something larger, isn't it? Something that is probably part of a bigger social trends or social change. But let's see other figures before. One of the aspects that this survey also includes is those related to education and also to economic activity, discrimination, and violence. So let's speak about that in the following slides. When we see population by education level, we can see how LGBT plus population tends to be or tends to have higher education than non-LGBT plus population. And this, at the first glance, is a counterintuitive finding, isn't it? Because probably we tend to believe something different. But you need to remember that 50% of this population is a young population, which actually we believe is in ages who attend education. So this is something to consider here. However, the survey also shows other type, for instance, of barriers that LGBT plus population face in order to develop in life. This one shows us social rejection at work. And we can see how, for instance, LGBT plus people tend to face higher prevalence of unequal treatment, offensive comments, social exclusion, and threats at work, at least in 10 percentage points higher than non-LGBT plus population. Another important topic is this one about discrimination. If you have been following the seminar 2 days ago, our General Director of Justice and Political Statistics, Dwight Lyer, explained a little bit more about our discrimination survey. But also here in the ENDISEG, we include a question about this. And what is important here, and something that I wanted to show you, is that the survey also allows to compare different groups in society. So in this one, we can compare 5 types of groups in society. There are cisgender men, cisgender women, Afro-descendant population, LGBT plus population, and trans women. And in this one, we can see how the higher prevalence of discrimination in the last 12 months is present actually in the transgender woman community and the LGBT plus population, even higher than the other groups. Something similar happens when we speak about violence. In this one, again, with these 5 groups, we can see how at least once in their lifetime, they experience or they confront some experiences with violence. And we can see how, again, transgender women or LGBT plus population have higher rates of this in comparison to other social groups. This is one of the key elements of the survey because it speaks about this concept that is intersectionality. And we can see that in different moments during the survey. Another important aspect, but that is less developed, for instance, in the media or in the public sphere, is that related to emotional problems. And when we ask in the last year if they have experienced, for instance, stress, insomnia, loss or increase in weight, distress, fear, or anxiety, or depression, in all these 5, people who self-identify as part of the LGBT plus community score higher than people which is not part of this population. And this is something that also speaks about these structural social conditions in which this community is still developed up until today in our country and probably in other parts. One of the key findings in this survey is one that has been studied in academia for a long time ago in different countries, and is that related to suicidal attempts of suicide. So we can see how LGBT plus population, when we compare to non-LGBT plus population, again score higher, at least 3 times higher than other type of population in this matter. And this is, as you can imagine, a public policy problem, public health problem, and this is something that the ENDISEG also pointed out. At the end of the survey, we also include some questions about the acceptance about LGBT plus people in our country. These are some answers from non-LGBT plus population. So when we ask, do you agree with same-sex couples showing their affection in public, like kissing, for example, we see that just 54.9% of non-LGBT plus people in our country accept this. When we ask, do you agree with same-sex couples should be allowed to marry, we see that the number is similar, but when we ask, do you agree with same-sex couples should be allowed to adopt children, we see that even the score is lesser than in the other two, when 43.8%. So this speaks about the relevance and visibility that this matter still deserves in our societies. Here at the Institute, when we published the survey 1 year and 4 months ago, we developed a very relevant dissemination and communication strategy in order not only to disseminate the information, but also to create that atmosphere with the LGBT plus community that even they can and they must capitalize this data in order to foster a better life and better opportunities. So we conduct different interviews, we present the data in different seminars and tables, in the Congress and in other places. We publish several times on social media, and we actually also develop a dashboard that is called Conociendo la Población LGBT+ in Mexico, and I invite you to see that dashboard, because this one has been very popular in the last months. This is some data about people who enter to the sites and see our data. And as you can see, there has been an increasing number sometimes, but we are very happy with the strategy about this. So just to sum up and move to the next part of the seminar, there are some key aspects about the importance and the use of the information coming from ENDISEG. So the LGBT plus community has built also on ENDISEG to come up with civil society projects at different levels. Congress peoples, for example, have drawn on the survey as a key data source to inform draft initiatives in different strands. For example, those related to transgender childhoods, transgender work inclusion, recognitions of non-binary population in Mexico City, and anti-conversion therapies regulation in the Federal Senate. Also, we present the data at the private sector, and they use it to revamp diversity and inclusion programs in different ways. And also, we present this one, as is this case, to the academic community, especially to underpin new research agendas on LGBT plus affairs. Just finally, some key takeaways about the survey. The ENDISEG sets international standards for gathering LGBT plus demographic data in Mexico, Latin America, and worldwide. Actually, this survey is somehow like an exception in different parts of the world in which they don't have this kind of reliable data on this population. And actually, in Latin America, the survey is at the forefront of this. The survey also highlights the gaps and way forward to achieve equality for the LGBT plus population as I just present. The survey addressed a historical vacuum and growing social demands for data information on this community. The ENDISEG sheds light on the LGBT plus struggles and progress, as you can see, and by measuring LGBT plus population, official statistics strengthen the community's standing in this for the public life. Thank you.
Vamos a pasar al siguiente ponente de UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, Hanka Thomas.
I don't.
¿Va a estar usted en el podio o se va a quedar ahí? Se lo voy a bajar.
Ahorita me presento, dale. No te preocupes. Gracias.
Ayúdame.
Aquí está. Listo. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cecilia Farfan. I'm head of research here at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies, so not Jacana Thomas, for those of you who know her. I have the pleasure of closing our event, so I'm delighted that I get that honor. So everyone that has participated in this seminar has thanked INEGI for the extraordinary work that you guys do in collecting this information and, more importantly, making it available for us researchers to work with that. So, of course, I will also join my colleagues to have thanked you for your work and also for coming to UC San Diego and share with us the fantastic work that you do. So let me start with an activity. I think all of us have been using the UCSD guest Wi-Fi quite a bit today. So let's, switch that up for a little bit. Everyone stand up, please. Thank you. So now that you're standing up, let me introduce myself again. My name is Queen Cecilia, and now you're living in the queendom of Cecilia. And everything that you know about yourself, forget about that. I've taken that away. If you identify as a man, if you identify as a woman, you don't have that anymore. If you have a house, if you rent an apartment, you don't have any of that. But I am not a terrible autocrat. I'm a little generous. So I'm going to give you $2,000, and you can buy some of these back from me, naturally. So with the $2,000 budget that you have, what would you purchase from me? Anyone? Yes. Let me get a microphone so that we can.
So if I had the 2,000, probably one of the first things would be owning property.
Okay, so you have 1,500 left. Okay.
Yeah, graduate education.
Okay.
And then no disability.
No disability. Okay. That's it. Who else? What would you buy with a $2,000 budget that I have given you? There are no right or wrong answers. This is just what would you choose? Now that you have nothing except the $2,000 that I have given you, what will you get?
¿Puede ser en español?
Sí.
Ok. Yo creo que compraría educación, primero que nada, asegurarla. Propiedad, claro. Esos son 1,400.
1,400, sí. Te quedan $600.
Y bueno, probablemente la no discapacidad, porque por lógica tendría discapacidad si no la compro, ¿no? Supongo.
Puede ser, son tus $2,000. ¿Quién más?
Las dos.
Ok, educación, mental healthy, son 1,300 y estoy entre indígenas y bilingüe.
¿No querría ser hombre?
No.
No, ok. ¿Quién quiere comprar ser hombre?
Yo compraría ser bilingüe, la verdad, para mejorar el inglés u otra lengua.
Ser bilingüe.
La propiedad, definitivamente, y la salud mental.
La salud mental, muy bien.
Es que me faltan $100.
Pues solo tienes 2,000.
Pues casi el medio idioma.
No, en el Queendom of Cecilia, aquí no hay descuento. Entonces, ¿qué compras?
Sería la estabilidad emocional, mental,
Ok.
no discapacidad y tener una propiedad.
Ok. Muy bien. ¿Alguien más? Bueno, como soy una autócrata generosa, ahora no tienen límite de lo que pueden comprar. ¿Qué comprarían?
Ahora sí, pues graduarme de tener la educación completa, ser bilingüe, tener una propiedad y estabilidad mental y no tener discapacidades.
Ok. ¿Quién más? Ya no tienen límite, ya no hay límite en su presupuesto.
I would choose the graduation education, owning a property, and stable mental health.
Ok, muy bien. ¿Alguien más?
Yo pues compraría la propiedad, definitivamente, el ser bilingüe.
Se las dejé muy barato, todo el mundo quiere propiedad. Ok.
Sí, yo creo que sí. Y pues lo de graduarme de la escuela. Creo que con eso estoy bien.
¿Solo eso?
Por el momento.
Por el momento. Bueno. So, all of you, essentially what describe is something that we can actually conceptualize in something that's called as a wheel of power and privilege. And so what you can see here is the closest you are to the center, the more power is likely that you will have. And this particular wheel comes from the Canadian government. So it's adapted to the Canadian context. But what's interesting here is essentially if you are a white, cisgender male who's heterosexual with no disability, that you're neurotypical, you're bilingual in both languages, you own property and have a post-secondary education, you're going to be doing very well for yourself, right? You can sit down now, thank you. Oh, I feel like we're in mass, okay. So essentially, the further away that you are from the center in this wheel, the harder your life is going to be in some elements, essentially because it's telling us how marginalized you are from society, right? So maybe I'm a male, but if I'm a gay man, I move away from what our societies traditionally understand as power. So why does this matter? So Julieta mentioned in her presentation that one of the things about the survey, this fantastic instrument that it allows us to do is better understand intersectionality. And this may sound like a very abstract academic word, but in reality it's something that we understand very well intuitively. So what does it mean to be a Mexican woman living in the US compared to being a white woman living in the US? So who here crosses the border every day, or almost every day? Once a week. Once a week, okay. So what is it like to be a man in Mexico compared to being a man in San Diego?
Can you ask again?
So what's the difference between being a young man? How old are you?
21.
21. What's the difference between 21 and being male in Mexico compared to being 21 and a male in San Diego?
Oh, now I'm like.
Are there any differences?
Well, not too much. I mean,
if the police stops you, which police do you rather to be stopped by? The Mexican police or the U.S. police?
Maybe the Mexican police.
Why?
Is going to be worse because they're gonna keep my money. So the U.S. probably gonna be more strict and be like more serious, but I can fake that I don't know English so they can let me go. But in Mexico, they probably get all my money or just mess with me.
So essentially what's your name?
Enrique.
Enrique is describing to us is something that we, as I said, understand inherently very well. What does it mean to be who I am, like if I identify as a lesbian woman in certain contexts compared to others? And so what INEGI's new survey does is that it really starts to allow us to think in a much more complex way about these questions. So Julieta had this information in her presentation, And this is something that, again, was very interesting to me, and I think I find it striking. So intersectionality matters because it really allows us to think about how do we design policy for people, right? How am I going to have a program that actually serves the needs of people? And what's interesting, as Julieta pointed out, is that, you know, people in early childhood, so before being 7 years old, become aware of their sexual orientation. Now, can you remember how old were you when you had your first crush in elementary school? Don't worry, I'm not gonna ask you who it was. You'll probably feel ashamed by that now, like, oh, I like that person. But what's interesting here is, again, if people, and this is information that it's gold because we didn't have this before. So think about what this means from a policy perspective. If I know now that people under 7, or most people, 43.4, become aware of their sexual orientation before the age of 7, what does that mean in terms of policy programs? What kind of education should we have in elementary school to make sure that we're providing adequate information for individuals, right? Otherwise, we're leaving them behind. Equally, right, when they asked about realizing or acting, you know, that it did not correspond with your birth sex, we see that number, as Julieta pointed out, jump up quite a bit, right? So 62.4%. And this is not just a number that's interesting abstractly, but it has very real consequences today. And if you think about, for instance, the United States, where there are debates about gender ideology, right? What they call gender ideology, not even a real thing, by the way. It tells us how should we be engaging with schools in order to serve these populations better. Now, let me push this idea a little bit more. So having this instrument is not knowing about a segment of the population that's separate, you know, from the rest of the country. Essentially, 1 in 20 identify as belonging to the LGBTI plus population. But what does that mean for democracy? And when we think about democracy indicators, like if I were to ask you, how do you know if a country's a democracy, what kind of things will you come up with? What is like a traditional idea? Ciro, you cannot join because you are the expert in the room. But what would be a traditional indicator for thinking about democracy? Can people vote? What else?
Elections.
Elections, right? So people can vote. We actually hold elections, right? So they have the right. There is a process. What else? What else tells us something about democracy? Freedom of speech? Yes, what else? Freedom of what else? Equal opportunity for what? To participate in political life, potentially. So one of the interesting things that this survey also should encourage us to think about is that when we think about democracy and these traditional indicators, we don't tend to think about the LGBTI population. But UCLA actually produced a report that looked at what is happening with democratic backsliding and the rights of the LGBTI population. And so essentially what they found out is that every time you start seeing the rights of this community being restricted, that's an early warning sign that democracy is also backsliding. And so what's interesting about this survey, to the extent that we will have more and more of these survey being implemented in Mexico, is the more we learn about how people, LGBTI people feel in Mexico, that's also an indicator about the health of our democracy and consolidation. And this is not something that it's linear, right? We would not necessarily think that countries in the European Union, for instance, are having issues with rights for this population. But Poland, I would say, is a poster child of what not to do, right? So we see that even countries that are members of the European Union are increasingly restricting these rights. Now, today is November 9. Does anyone know what day of remembrance it is today? So Israel and Germany, on November 9th, this is when Kristallnacht happened, right? So La Noche de los Cristales Rotos, when we saw this incredible violence against the Jewish population and also synagogues and essentially anyone living in Germany. Obviously, this was a prelude to the Holocaust. And in addition to the Jewish population and Roma community, people who were from the LGBTI population were also sent to extermination camps because of their sexual orientation. Now, what this tells you is that progress in this area of rights is not linear. And what do I mean by that? It doesn't mean that once you have it, it's going to be stable and it stays there, and then you're going to have progressively more rights, but rather something that constantly needs to be defended. Sorry, I'm not checking my text messages, I'm just checking my time. Perfect. So anyway, just to sum up this point, again, this matters, this instrument matters because it's also an indicator about the health of our democracy. Now, if we look, and again, Julieta shared this slide with you, in terms of how people, respond to this, in Mexico, we're very much failing the promise of democracy for this population in particular. And again, not that they're separate. Again, 1 in 20 Mexicans identify in this category. And so what this shows is that we're not the inclusive society that democratic governments should be, right? And so what we see here, it's not only about whether or not you want people of the same sex to be able to be married, but rather how its democracy is underserving them as well. And so these are appallingly low numbers. And hopefully, as we continue to work again in terms of having access to them, this should improve. Now, this matters in particular considering that even if all states have, give the right for people of the same sex to marry, we see that acceptance, of this marriage is not necessarily 100%. And so we would like to see these numbers improve. Now, what does gender have to do with organized crime? So insecurity and the violence that they experience, yes, that's one option. Anyone else? Why would I bring organized crime to the table?
The gender behind the people who are in the organized crime. I guess if you're a woman, man, or not identified, I guess there are different levels of people. Like I don't know. There's less women involved, or they're in the below of the chain of the system that it's organized crime. That's what I think. So if someone, by the way, gets me a bottle of water, you'll have unlimited funds for, my kingdom forever. Thank you. So yes, so one of the interesting things about studying organized crime, and that's my main area of research, is that there's a lot of stereotypes around it, right? So when you think of a narco, and I say that as a male in particular, what do you think about? Like if I ask you, for my Halloween party, you have to come dressed up as a narco, what will you wear? What will you bring? Sky is the limit.
Un sombrero, probablemente una pistola de juguete, un
Sombrero,
chaleco,
¿qué más?
botas.
Uh-huh.
¿Y qué más? ¿Y ya, probablemente?
¿Ya? ¿Quién más? ¿Qué se tienen que poner? ¿O qué se pondrían? Veo así risas nerviosas de sí sé, pero no quiero contar. No hay respuesta correcta. ¿Qué te pondrías? Sí. Ya te comiste los doritos de mi reino, ahora necesito que me contestes.
No sé, yo creo que pues algo buchón, algo no sé, quizá no sé, como algo buchón tipo Asterix, o sea, no sé.
Como estoy más confundida.
Como
ahora.
Quizá no, botas no. O sea, quizá unos tacones, como ¿cómo se llama?
¿De qué
¿Blazer?
color?
Como blazer, así como ropa buchona quizá. O sea, es que no sé cómo describir la ropa buchona. Pero,
¿Alguien que le ayude a la compañera a describir la ropa buchona?
Ivana.
Pues según yo, algo muy característico de ellos, sobre todo, son como los cinturones y cierto tipo de hebillas, como de marcas o así. Les gusta como mucho enseñar marcas.
Ya se acordó, ok.
Sí, ya me acordé. Pues sí, como ropa, es lo que dice mi compañera Ivana, ropa de marca. O sea, no ropa de marca, bueno, sí. Como, no sé, siento que como los narcos, siento que lucen mucho como ropas de marca, carros, así como, no sé.
O sea,
camionetas, jeeps.
O sea, llegas en camioneta a mi fiesta.
Ajá, llevo en camioneta.
¿La más grande?
Y con ropa, una bolsa, quizá una bolsa, no sé, Gucci.
Ahorita estaba hablando pues con mi amiga y también estábamos viendo lo del bigote. Bueno, yo no sé, o sea, pues cuando capturaron al Chapo, que pasaron la noticia, pues traían bigote. Y el otro día también en clase nos proyectaron una de Pablo Escobar, creo, y también traía bigote. Entonces me imagino que pues con un bigote falso también y un sombrero, no sé, norteño, algo así.
Entonces, bigote, botas, cinturón de marca, chaleco en algún caso, llevo en camioneta, ¿no? ¿Qué más? ¿Arma? ¿Llevo un arma? ¿Sí? ¿Y cuál llevo? Una cadenota con cruz. Ok. Con la Virgen. Ok, muy bien. Bueno, todo lo que acaban de describir me parece al sentido del estereotipo del narco, ¿no? Y me parece que justamente cuando pensamos en crimen organizado, muchas de las cosas que pensamos es todos hablan español en la sala, ¿verdad? Ok, bueno, lo vamos a hacer en Spanglish porque somos USMEX. Hay un estereotipo de la masculinidad, ¿no? Y pensamos en el mundo del crimen organizado como un mundo que le pertenece exclusivamente a los hombres, porque claro, las mujeres normales no somos violentas, ¿no? O sea, si tú eres una mujer, no, y eres femenina, ¿no? En realidad, entonces no vas a ser parte del crimen organizado, y si lo eres es porque te casaste con algún narco, ¿no? Caíste en malos pasos o tendrás un tío o una tía que trabaja en el crimen organizado, pero tú, digamos, no tienes una decisión propia. Y ese es el estereotipo que existe frente al crimen organizado. En los últimos 2 años, desde USMEX, hemos trabajado con la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito, que lo que quiere hacer es pensar cómo pensamos la parte de género en cuestiones de crimen organizado, es decir, cuáles serían los temas que tienen que entrar justamente para alejarnos de este estereotipo, ¿no? Que este es un mundo exclusivamente masculino y violento, para realmente entender este fenómeno. Y uno de los grandes problemas que tenemos en entender, digamos, la parte de género y crimen organizado es que nos hacen falta muchísimos datos. Ningún estado realmente recolecta buena información en esto. Ahora bien, si yo les digo que vemos temas de género y crimen organizado, cuando digo género, ¿qué se imaginan? Ahora ya debe ser más sofisticado después de la explicación que les dio Julieta, de que
hace referencia al género, pero en general, digamos, uno de los problemas que enfrentamos es que cuando decimos que queremos entender género y crimen organizado, inmediatamente la asociación es mujeres y crimen organizado, ¿no? Y se reduce, digamos, el concepto de género exclusivamente a uno de mujeres. Ahora, si ustedes estuvieron aquí ayer, esto hace sentido en parte, ¿no?, por las brechas de ingreso tan brutales que nos demostró el INEGI existen, ¿no? Y por eso hay muchos temas de género que se enfocan en mujeres, pero no es lo único a lo que nos referimos cuando hablamos de género. Y esto tiene que ver con cuál es entonces, digamos, lo que se está pidiendo a los estados miembros, y por cierto, la Convención contra el Crimen Organizado Transnacional es uno de los instrumentos internacionales más ratificados a nivel internacional, es decir, la mayoría de los países han firmado esta convención y dicen sí, queremos implementar digamos, el limitar las actividades de crimen organizado. Y a la conclusión que llegamos, y estas son cuando hablamos cuáles serían las estadísticas que responden a un tema o transversalizan el género, no es solamente decir, tengamos datos desagregados por sexo, sino realmente tengamos, ¿no?, datos que nos ayuden a captar esa complejidad. Y, por supuesto, la encuesta del INEGI, algo que logra hacer, sin duda, es captar esa complejidad. Ahora bien, si yo les estoy diciendo, no queremos solamente datos que digan hombre y mujer, ¿qué datos les gustaría entender, tener para entender, digamos, los temas de crimen organizado con perspectiva de género? Enrique, si ya no me voltea a ver a mí, señora, está bien. O sea, si no se trata solo de darme estadísticas de qué mujeres han participado en actividades criminales, ¿qué otro tipo de datos serían interesantes?
En relación a lo que acaba de presentar Julieta, por ejemplo, pienso en consumo en consumidoras o consumidores, o cuando no hay acceso a trabajo o hay discriminación por pertenecer a la población LGBT+, ¿no? Y el crimen organizado se vuelve una opción casi única porque pues, me reconoce como persona, ¿no? Por ejemplo.
Exacto. ¿Alguien más? ¿Qué otra cosa sería interesante de conocer del crimen organizado? Le deben unas chelas a Enrique, todos.
Una fiesta buchona.
Buchona estética. Probablemente sí saber si al crimen organizado realmente le interesa el género. Si le interesa el género, perdón. O no lo toma en cuenta y solo me veía a las personas como un número.
Y si le interesara el género, ¿cómo te imaginarías que le interesa, por ejemplo?
Sí, probablemente sería como, no sé, utilizar a las personas para aprovecharse en esas áreas.
Les voy a dar un ejemplo. Si ustedes son miembros del crimen organizado y tienen que lavar dinero, ¿a quién utilizarían? ¿A una señora rica que vive en La Joya, no? ¿O no un hombre mexicano de 25 años que cruza la frontera todos los días?
Yo utilizaría a la mujer de La Joya porque pues es rica y todo, entonces no, como que no se va a dar tanto cuenta. En cambio, pues mexicano, pues está el estereotipo también de pues que el mexicano se dedica a eso. Entonces, si yo fuera parte, yo agarraría a alguien que no fuera tan obvio y pues chance me funciona muchas veces, ¿no?
Es correcto, lo que acabas de describir es algo que le llamo la paradoja de la invisibilidad, donde justamente el crimen organizado utiliza personas que están en el centro, digamos, de esta rueda de poder y privilegio que les mostré, porque claro, va a ser más difícil que las autoridades, incluso los medios, sospechen de aquellas personas, en particular de mujeres, ¿no?, que vienen de una extracción de clase alta. Pero bueno, esto importa justamente porque seguimos teniendo un vacío de información impresionante cuando se trata de entender, en el caso de México, uno de los fenómenos más importantes del país, y lo que hace también esta encuesta es, como mencionaba Julieta, darnos luces justamente sobre esa parte de la población la cual no habíamos tenido información hasta ahora. Entonces, solamente para recapitular, este concepto de la interseccionalidad, que es algo que todos entendemos de manera intuitiva, ¿no? Esta encuesta lo que hace es darnos luces para entender justamente la complejidad de la población en México, y no exclusivamente desde la perspectiva hombre-mujer, sino realmente desde toda la diversidad que tenemos en el país. Lo otro que es interesante es, nos ayuda a pensar en la salud de nuestra democracia desde indicadores no tradicionales. Y aquí es muy interesante pensar en que en la medida en que tengamos indicadores sobre esta población, también nos va a decir cómo estamos en el tema de realmente ofrecer y cumplir con esta promesa democrática de representación. Vemos que los números no son particularmente buenos hasta ahora, pero esperamos sin duda que se mantenga, aunque como vimos con el caso de Polonia, no son avances que una vez que se logran son consolidados, sino que tienen que lucharse por ellos todos los días. Y finalmente, si pensamos en las estadísticas de género, una de las grandes áreas donde hacen falta estos datos es en crimen organizado. Y en este sentido me parece que el INEGI es un gran ejemplo también de cómo deberíamos de estar pensando cómo recolectamos información, y nuevamente no hablar de género como si fuera exclusivamente mujeres, sino realmente todo lo que comprende. Voy a dejarlo ahí para que le hagamos preguntas a Julieta, y muchas gracias.
Si puede pasar, por favor. ¿Quién dijo yo? ¿Jóvenes?
Thank you. I think it's a very important survey because it shows not only the data. I think it's very important the way to collect the data and the training. If you can tell us about, you tell us that use of tablets and tools like that to give confidence to the people that is answering the survey, but also to process the information, to distinguish different opinions. I think it's very important to have a professional and trained approach to the issue, because I think also there are a lot of misunderstanding, even in people that is talking about these issues. For example, when I was working in the INE, some people ask for compulsory candidatures of the political parties to the sexual diversity community. But they really don't know what are they talking about. And for example, they do things like that. Every political party has the obligation to nominate people from the LGBT and plus community, even to political parties that are in the extreme right. And I think people that really is part of this community want to be part of this kind of political parties. So understand the concepts. If you can talk about another thing that I was really shocked is the moment that the support of the rights of the gay marriage, I think, in the United States broke down in 2016. I think I thought it's because Trump and the electoral campaign, but it shows us that the political environment can make a big damage to the culture and the tolerance in the societies. And maybe we are talking about one field that anything is gained forever and is necessary to fight all the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Ciro? Sí, ¿verdad? Ok. Muy bien. Gracias, Ciro. Yo creo que los tres comentarios generales son muy sugerentes para hablar de diferentes cosas. Voy a referirme primero a lo primero que comentabas, que es lo que significa, por ejemplo, levantar este tipo de encuestas para un instituto como el nuestro. Pero yo diría que en general este tipo de encuestas, en donde desde luego hay un primer challenge, una primera barrera que tiene que ver con los conceptos, ¿no? Entonces, hubo un desarrollo conceptual bastante interesante al interior del instituto, que decía, se trabajó con la CNDH o el CONAPRED para justamente utilizar los conceptos adecuados, pero también con la sociedad civil, y creo que es un acompañamiento que se hace además como una buena práctica en el instituto, no de manera excepcional a la ENDISEG, sino en otros temas, ¿no? Como el de afrodescendencia, por ejemplo, y algunos otros. Entonces, es algo que tenemos como parte de las labores que realizamos al interior. Desde luego que las encuestadoras, como en otros programas, utilizan diferentes instrumentos como manuales que se desarrollan ex profeso, digamos, para este tipo de levantamientos, y también una serie de entrenamientos muy específicos sobre la sensibilidad de los temas, sobre los conceptos y sobre también cómo aproximarte a este tipo de entrevistas. Son encuestas similares, por ejemplo, aunque cada una tiene su lógica, pero en estos temas sensibles, como los que pueden ser violencia contra mujeres, que preguntamos también en casas y hogares, en donde cuenta mucho también el training, digamos, que tienen las personas encuestadoras. En ese sentido, sí hubo una preparación previa muy relevante. Y también yo diría que en el procesamiento y hacia adelante, incluso hasta la fase de diseminación, publicación y comunicación de los datos, también bajo la idea de que, como bien comentabas, muchos son conceptos que, si bien pueden ser más cercanos o más familiares en un ambiente como este a personas que estamos interesados en el tema o interesadas, desde luego que para la población, digamos, at large, pues no son temáticas que se sepan o se conozcan a detalle con todas las características necesarias. Entonces, ese también fue un reto en todo el proceso de generación del dato. Yo diría que también en la parte de cómo comunicarlo. Uno de los ejemplos que ponía, que es esta galletita que fue muy exitosa, que no es una creación nuestra, sino algo que adaptamos de otro lado, es parte de esto. Siempre que comunicamos este tipo de encuestas o de información, creo que hacemos también algo de pedagogía o de literacidad, simplemente explicando los conceptos. Esa es parte, creo yo, del reto, pero también me parece que del éxito de la publicación de los datos y la diseminación. Mucho de lo que no habla ahora, pero que tiene que ver con que, como en otras encuestas, pues intentamos detonar pues conversatorios o también una suerte de que algunos podcasts o personas de la misma comunidad que la misma comunidad sigue, conocieran la encuesta y se refirieran a ella en sus espacios como una suerte de, digámosle, como apropiación de los datos de parte de la comunidad, que yo creo que es algo muy importante. Y claro, ha sido útil por ejemplo, para informar acciones afirmativas o demás en el instituto, en el INE o en algunos otros respecto a las cuotas que le llaman ahora de representatividad. Y yo creo que ese es uno de los muchos ejemplos en los cuales una encuesta y los datos que tiene esta encuesta pues son relevantes. Y desde luego es muy interesante la gráfica de Gallup del support, digamos, para las relaciones homosexuales, gays o lesbianas a lo largo del tiempo. Y sí, yo creo que sin haberme metido a estudiar necesariamente a detalle en Estados Unidos el tema, sí creo que tiene que ver con el tema de los cambios societales y políticos relacionados con Trump en Estados Unidos. Y yo creo que lo que más nos podría dejar esto, entre otras cosas, es esta idea de que son derechos que se tienen, pero que no necesariamente están escritos en piedra en muchos lugares, ¿no? Y ese es parte también de la incertidumbre de la democracia, ¿no? Que sabemos que en México, por ejemplo, estos 32 estados, los que tenemos, ya han aprobado este tipo de legislaciones, hay jurisprudencia en la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, y sin embargo, sigue siendo muy importante la visibilidad, porque finalmente, como vemos en otros países, pues siempre pueden existir backlash de diferente índole, ¿no? Que afecten los derechos de estas comunidades. En general, no sé si Ceci.
I was told we have to do it in English because of recording agreement, but you don't feel like you have to repeat all of that.
Should I repeat?
No, you're good. But moving, so let me abuse my power as discussant and moderator, and I'm wondering what would you say was one of the things or two things that surprised you the most from the results of this survey? So you truly were implementing, a never-before survey in Mexico. This is a titanic exercise for many reasons, including the privacy one that you pointed out. But, when you had the first meeting and they show you the results, what were two things that you would say this was, I was not expecting that, or what surprised you?
Wow, that's a nice question. But probably one is in demographics, the number of people who self-identify as bisexual, for instance, no? Because it's something that is underrepresentative in our daily life, and actually they don't have that visibility in comparison to gay men or lesbians either. But yeah, the number is very high. It's almost 50%. That is one. The other, I would say, is that one of 25% of transgender people haven't said anybody about their own self-identity. So that is it's a very stunning number, isn't it? It's like a 1 in 4 have the possibility to communicate to anybody this situation that is not just like a situation, because it's a core aspect of their own lives, that is identity. So I think these two are some of the things that actually keep me thinking about this. But there are another kind of numbers there that are so relevant that we already have it, and we need to use it in public life.
Oh, we have a question back there. No.
Thanks a lot for presenting the results and for the discussion, Cecilia. I had two questions, which are mostly out of curiosity. One is if you looked at whether social, like rejection or discrimination, is also correlated with age, like if younger people feel less discriminated than older people. And this is connected to a second question, which is a little bit about dynamics. You showed some results that asks people whether in the last year they have experienced any of these events, and I was wondering if you also asked, like, throughout their lifetime to try to understand whether these patterns are changing, whether Mexico is becoming like more accepting of diversity. But thank you a lot. This is super interesting and very important.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. And I don't know exactly. I mean, I don't have the numbers now. I believe there could be a relationship between the awareness about this concept of discrimination in relation to younger ages. But to be honest, I don't know. But we will look at that and let you know. And about the other question, I think the survey is a picture in that moment of life. So actually, we don't know the life trajectory and if that changed in life. So it's just the picture of the people who was surveyed at that moment. But there are some changes in terms of perception of discrimination between different states, for example. And I think there are some interesting relationships with the ENADIS, that is the discrimination survey in that matter. But yeah, more or less, I think that's the sort of answers. Yeah.
Someone else?
Hi. In the interest of showing the information, I compared in my mind with the last presentation about how mothers are the ones that are more involved in the raising of the children in many different houses around Mexico, and in the showing of this data that shows that the first people, or like the moms, are the ones in the family or like in your circle that first know, and I think that is really important point to show. And in the sense of showing, like if you Google it, it's going to show, and I think that it's usually when you search for this kind of information, it's not like from a relatable source, and I think that's the important part of this, because INEGI, it's a really it's a powerful source that you can use in school rather than just in a number conversation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that as this is a really new survey and new data, how do you think it could evolve in the future? So this kind of recompilation of information doesn't stop, and it spreads more than it already is, because it's a really good data that you are showing us today.
No, thank you. What's your name?
Leilani.
Leilani. Okay. Thank you for your comment and question. I do believe that. I mean, I think the survey is like a turning point in terms of availability of data about this population in our country. And yes, certainly, I think when we look at, for instance, some videos or even memoirs of people who is part of this community, they often tend to turn first to the internet in search of information, and I think that is something that has been a game changer in the last decade, and so in this matter. But yeah, that is true that we don't have that, or we haven't had that kind of very reliable information and availability of that in Mexico until the survey. So, and this probably is a very strong and powerful instrument for the people who are in these paths in life. And as you mentioned, the role of the mother, for instance, I think one of the things that this survey shows is the relevance of the supportive networks. And there is one slide that I didn't include, but is available online, about what was the reaction of fathers, mothers, at the moment they knew about this. And almost more than 95% of them, they show some degree of acceptance. And that is a key element to understand this, because when you are in this kind of paths, in this kind of roads, you are surrounded by fear, for instance. So it is important to know that there is a high degree of acceptance in overall terms, according to the data. Of course, each life is different, and each path as well.
Well, mine is more of a, I think, personal question. I want to ask you, like, we have been talking during these days, during different panels, about the expectations that these researchers or data collections that we get might find for either public policies or maybe for their work on the matters. So what are like your personal expectations for the work in this area? Because this is pretty new compared to other areas. So what would you like to see on further research or in the long-term data, and like what would you like to see develop through this starting process?
Yeah, well, that's very good question. As part of the institute, part of our constitutional mandate is not only to generate the information, but also to foster dissemination. So for us, these kind of activities are quite relevant, are at the core of our main task. And in the last 15 or 16 months, we have been disseminating this survey in very different kinds of events, some of them with policymakers, Congress people, but probably some of the most relevant places has been with part of the LGBT plus community. And this is some of the things that we really liked and we really look at, because for us, a data that is not known is a data that could be useless. So it's quite relevant, I think, and our expectation in the future is to disseminate even more this data. And actually, the survey that is, as you may notice, a complex survey, probably needs to be also refined in the following years, because it's like it's a moving population with different changes over time. So probably we need to rethink some aspects in the coming years. But for now, the instrument has proved to be essential, I would say, in this conversation.
So when can we expect the next edition? I know you just published the first one, but,
Yes.
so no pressure, but just...
Yeah, no, these kind of surveys that are demographics, we usually publish every 4 or 5 years, because the overall assumption is that demographics doesn't change that rapidly in society. So probably in 3 or 4 years, because the publication was 16 months ago, yeah, more or less.
So on behalf of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies and UC San Diego, allow me to thank INEGI once again for taking the time, a tremendous amount of time, 4 days, to come and share with us your expertise, the incredible work that you are doing. And so everyone, please join me in thanking them for all of this.